Okay, so I'm going to tell you what the one thing which is stopping you from retiring that you probably don't even realize. In fact, I'd go as far as saying it's probably the most common issue that I come across when I speak with clients. The worst thing is the threat isn't even visible. You can't even compare it. Well, in this video, I'm going to give you not only the answers to why this is such a problem, but also a really clear way for you to solve it. And while the solution may seem obvious, it isn't simple. So let me give you a real world example that I'll go through which highlights this. So the process for regulated advice follows a type of structure. Assuming it makes sense to follow forward to move on to advice, there's normally another meeting where we get really intentional with the planning. This is typically where the most obvious issues come out, and the ones where about 80% of people tend to have this problem for understandable reasons. Instead of telling you this problem that I see from clients, let me tell you this problem that I had. So I had a small workplace pension with Aegon, and all I wanted to do was consolidate it. And being an advisor, it was quite easy for me to do the research and go, right, okay, it makes sense to move this. Anyway, it took me 5 months to complete the transfer. And this was not a large amount of money. If it wasn't for just sheer perseverance and frustration, I probably would have given up. So I will call this out because it's indicative of the problem that we have in the pension industry. It felt from my side they did almost everything possible to be obstructive, whether that was the case or not. Here was the timeline. I requested the transfer, they rejected it because it was a different number from what they'd provided on the paperwork they provided me. They sent me a secure email, but for some reason they had my national insurance wrong, so I couldn't open it. I contacted them again via phone, took ages to get through, and then they sent a different secure system. Fine, got access to that. I contacted them again, but now they needed certified ID documents to consider doing anything because I'd moved. Fair enough, I understand that they need to do security checks, but it wasn't easy. They were only able to accept certified documents via post. So I had to then go to the post office, get the details certified, and then get it sent recorded delivery. Because if you go on the faff of getting things certified and then it gets sent off and they go, oh, we never received it, and it happens all the time. And even though I sent that back, they then decided to freeze my account for some reason I never really found out. Anyway, it took 5 months, and to be clear, not all of that was Aegon. Some of that, it took me a couple of weeks to get round to it because it's not a priority. But the point I'm trying to make with that is that I do this every single day, and I understand the process. So it's no wonder that most people really struggle when they've got multiple pensions to try and keep a track and keep things sorted. So I don't just want to do this to rant. I want to say this is not easy. In the FT, there was an old article around letter of authority where that's where advisors get authority from their clients to gather information. And they called it the bane of the industry. It's completely normal to see extensive delays when there are various schemes and we've got to wait for information to come back. When it comes back, it's often incomplete. And the problem with all this is it all takes time and it stands in the way of understanding what people have got and even advising them. And until you have that, you can't retire with confidence. A study found that 75% of UK adults don't know how much they have in their pension. That's from Standard Life. And this indicates that a significant proportion of the population just simply don't understand the value of their retirement savings. Even more worryingly, in the study, 79% of those aged between 55 and 64 who are at the most crucial stage of their retirement planning couldn't put a figure on their pension pot. So the biggest thing I see that stops people from hitting their goals is inertia. That is just not being able to understand what is going on with the finances. And I want to give you 4 real world examples I've come across the advice process, which ends up costing clients for lots of reasons. Maybe a known reason and an unknown reason, but it's still costing you. Also, within the description, I've included a guide from a company called Intuitive, and it's on contact details for making and requests for submitting a letter of authority. And what that will provide you is if you just simply cannot get an idea of who to contact for your pension scheme, it'll at least give you hopefully one contact point that you can go to as a starting point. Now, just to be clear, as a member, you may have a different contact point already, so check that first. But hopefully that will be helpful to some of you so that you can maybe have a look at getting these information requests out there. So let's go through those real world examples. And one of the issues I see is because of the herding cat situation with various schemes. What happens is they've got pensions that have been accumulated over a working life and they've all got different investment strategies. So I've discussed previously the issues around lifestyling, where the scheme is set up by default to de-risk closer to a selected retirement date, normally around age 65. The problem with this is all based on the old system where individuals used to have to purchase an annuity. And while that made absolute sense in the old world, because the last thing you'd want to happen is for the market to take a dip just before you're about to make an irreversible purchase like you would an annuity. Nowadays, a lot of individuals are staying within drawdown and drawing down on their money over a 25, 30-year time horizon, even at age 60. So what they've often done is they've reduced the risk in the portfolio and reduced the return. And this is a great example, the problem about not acting in accordance with a financial plan, as in, and it's something I'm always driving home to my clients, the financial plan, as in what's important to you, how do we make sure that your goals align to your money? That is the most important thing. And often the strategies around the pensions just don't align to that. Say, for example, you're 60 and your scheme is lifestyled its way out of some equity content and that's reduced the allocation. It's no exaggeration to say that could potentially cost tens of thousands of pounds in lost growth over a couple of years. So these really are hidden costs that can have a big impact on your retirement or maybe legacy if you don't spend it. Another recent example where this can cost you so much was around Liz Truss's calamitous mini budget. And I'm going to quote a Guardian article here, and it says, "It is estimated that in terms of the big providers, about £10 billion is being funneled through lifestyle funds. They're often labelled as cautious, low risk, or protected. God help me. But in the worst cases, these funds lost close to 40%, or they dropped close to 40%, I should say, during 2022, during the point around the mini budget. So we have to be intentional. We have to understand what the schemes are doing." Okay, number two, another one that I've seen through high earners, where it speaks to inertia, and it may be a bit unfair to call it inertia, but it does speak to having not understanding what's going on with the different pension pots. So as an advisor, you do naturally tend to deal with people who earn a little bit more. And the more you earn, generally speaking, the more complexity there is, especially around pensions. One of these issues is what's called the tapered annual allowance, which limits how much tax relief you can get on pension contributions. Just to give you a bit of a gist, there is threshold and adjusted income. If your threshold income, which is just generally your salary and some other additional benefits, bonus overtime, is around over 200,000, that's minusing things like relief at source pension contributions, and then your adjusted income, which is throwing back in employer contributions, is over 260, you get your annual allowance tapered. Okay, so how does the tapering effect work? Well, basically it means that if you meet both thresholds, your annual allowance at 60,000 starts to decrease, and you lose £2 for every adjusted income over £260,000. And this can go all the way down to £10,000. I'm just going to include this bit from LCP here because it's a useful little graphic. So if you have very high adjusted income, then your tax relief on your contributions could be significantly reduced and you could potentially overfill your pension and get hit by a tax charge. Now, the taper also used to be lower in previous years. So I've seen examples of high earners who just had no idea they had big bonuses in the past. And what will happen is, unfortunately, there's a letter eventually will land from HMRC in a horrible brown envelope on your door, often many years later, saying that you've got a tax bill to pay because you will hit this taper, plus potentially interest and late payments. Now, the thing is, if you're proactive and on top of this, there can sometimes be options called scheme pays, where the scheme pays the tax charge if you get it in at certain points. They'll typically have periods, for example, 4-6 months after the tax year end where you're required to put the stats in with the scheme. There are two options. So basically what happens here is the scheme pays the tax charge, as the name suggests. There are two options, which I'm not going to go into now, called mandatory scheme pays and voluntary scheme pays, with slightly different rules. But the take home for this video is, if this is likely to apply, it can seriously cost you and you need to be on top of it. So having inertia on maybe not necessarily organising things can actually end up costing you big as far as tax charges. Okay, so the third one is just about leaving valuable tax relief on the table. And it's all too often a missed opportunity with pension planning. So I just want to explain what effective tax rate is. And it's basically, it's a phrase to indicate the tax rate that you'll pay when withdrawing from the pension at a later stage, including your personal allowances and your individual tax position. For example, if a high rate taxpayer has a £100 pension withdrawal from a defined contribution pension, this would typically result in 25% tax-free cash, 75% of taxable income, that's £30 tax. So £30 of tax for £100 of withdrawal is a 30% effective tax rate. So why does this matter? Well, it's important to bear in mind when considering pension contributions prior to retirement, there is typically a window, especially for higher earners, where they'll be earning more and able to get higher tax relief than the effective tax rate they draw out. Let me give you an example. So I've got someone called John who's 59, he's looking to retire at 60. He's a high rate taxpayer and he's built reasonable pension provisions. If he makes an additional contribution, we're going to assume he gets 40% tax relief. So if he was to make a pension contribution of 10 grand, he'd get 40% tax relief. If it's a relief at source scheme, he would pay £8,000 into the pension and he'd receive £2,000 tax relief by the scheme. He'll then get £2,000 claimed back via his self-assessment. So it cost him £6,000 to get a £10,000 contribution. Now let's consider the effective tax rate at the other end. So let's assume that this individual is wanting £35,000 per year every year for the rest of his life and he's got sufficient income. We're also not going to assume he's got state pensions. They would reduce his effective tax rate. Again, this is just an example, assuming the early bits of retirement. So let's say he needs 35 grand. 12,570 of that defined contribution pot would sit within the personal allowance, so £0 tax. 8,750 is tax-free cash, £0 tax. 13,680 is taxable at 20%, that's 2,736. So his effective tax rate is 2,736 divided by 35,000, 7.82. And that assumes he's taken 35 gross, I should say, just to be clear. The whole thing that I'm just trying to raise there with that very simple example is it's just a case of pushing past the inertia and saying, look, when you're retiring, do you think you're going to be able to use these advantages, and should we make additional contributions? The number 4, and the very last one I want to raise, is similar to what I've mentioned on the videos, which is about having no plan or no strategy. And I actually think the conclusion of this is pretty bittersweet. It's happened loads of times where I've sat down with clients and we've had discussions and they've said to me in early meetings, look, I'd love to be able to retire. And it's clear they've not been happy in work for some time and their mind's been elsewhere while they've been working, which has stopped them taking action. And they've had a lack of certainty and conviction if they actually have enough for the rest of their life. And there's been multiple times we've gone through this, the full planning exercise. We've gathered all the information, we've built the strategy. And it's really clear that they can retire, which is obviously great. But the bittersweet element is that sometimes it's clear they could have retired many years ago. And, you know, I've had situations with clients where they've almost been like, I can't believe it. I can't believe that I've waited as long as I have done to seek advice or to just make this decision. And of course, it's good news to be able to tell someone that they can retire. It's, you know, it's often going to be a really elated meeting. But there is an element to it where they might have spent years working a job where they didn't need to and didn't enjoy the fruits of their labour, because you only get so much time in retirement to enjoy what you worked for. So just something to think about. You know, why don't you let me know in the comments, do you think inertia is affecting your ability to retire? Well, if so, I've done a video which is how you can make 2024 the year you retire. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.